Today, I'm going to be talking about research I did with a colleague at the University of Vermont about the Hunger Games, and this was published in an edited volume. This is going to be focusing primarily on the first movie, although I will allude to later movies as well as a little bit to the books. So, as background, The Hunger Games takes place in a dystopian future that is hundreds of years um, in the former United States. So, the background is that there was a civil war in which districts revolted against a capital, and as punishment, the children in the districts had to compete in a yearly Hunger Games in which they had to fight one another to the death. So, our story focuses on a female tribute in the Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen. It's played by Jennifer Lawrence, as you see here in the movie poster. And she is a character who begins life in one of the districts. So, The Hunger Games has some intentional similarities to the Roman Empire. Some of the characters' names allude to that time period. The country of Panem, where The Hunger Games takes place, is taken from a phrase that translates to bread and circuses, meaning the food and entertainment that was used in the Roman Empire to distract the public from all of the horrors that were going on. So essentially, what we have here is a postmodern twist on gladiators in the Colosseum, in which The Hunger Games is a reality television show. The argument that we make in the chapter is that The Hunger Games tells a central narrative of class inequality, but shows other systems of oppression are also present in this imagined future. So, what's interesting to me in thinking about these dystopian futures is what can we imagine and what can't we imagine could possibly be different. So there's this strong narrative of class and class rebellion in the story of the Hunger Games, but very little about how we could imagine gender and race differently. So, thinking about the story that the Hunger Games tells us about class inequality in the future, there's this central narrative where the districts, particularly the outlying districts, districts 10, 11, and 12, District 12 being where our heroine, Katniss Everdeen, and her potential love interests live, that these districts are characterized by powerlessness, poverty, hunger, and fear of the capital. And the image here is a central image in the film and in the books, where one of Katniss's love interests, Peeta, is giving her a loaf of bread when she's nearly starving to death. In contrast, the capital is characterized by power, technology, wealth, and style. I'll come back to talking about style in a few minutes. But as far as technology goes, we know that the capital has hovercrafts and trains that travel at 200 miles an hour. So here there's this really clear, stark difference between the poverty in the districts and the wealth of the capital. So this sets up the class conflict that is part of the central narrative of the story. So we see that class shapes the nature of the games themselves. So first of all, it's the children in the districts, not the children in the capital, that fight to the death as tributes. We also see that children from the wealthier districts, who are called career tributes, are better prepared and are supported by sponsors, and they're often the favorites to win the Hunger Games. And then in the poorer districts, the mechanism of the game is such that the children from the poorest families are the most likely to be chosen as tributes. So the class inequalities present in this imagined future society are built into or reproduced in the dynamics of the games themselves. So in sum, we're told a story about class, but we're also shown a society that is also organized around race and around gender. So, in a 2011 interview, which was just prior to the start of the filming of the first installment of the series, Suzanne Collins, who's the author of the novels and was the co author of the screenplay for the first film, Collins described how some of her characters, such as Katniss, were written to be racially ambiguous. And Collins said, "It is a time period where hundreds of years have passed from now. There's been a lot of ethnic mixing." So, what we see here is an intention to portray a future that is post race. And in the book and in the film, race and racial inequality are really not discussed aside from some passing remarks about people's phenotypes or appearance. But we do see visually in the film how race matters. So first of all, we see that in the Capitol and in District 12, the residents are almost exclusively white. We see some people of color in the Capitol. Interestingly, they're almost always shown alone. We never see families of color or couples of color. And in contrast, we see that the people of District 12 are half or maybe mostly African American, and this is described as the agricultural district. So there's some interesting backstory that we're not privy to here. So how was it that massive resegregation happened? That is to say, African Americans living across what is now the contemporary United States got relocated to District 12 in Pan Am. We don't really know what has happened here in terms of the racial dynamics that happened in the background of the story. So there was some debate over the casting of the film, particularly in regards to the children that were the tributes. So as I said, the futures in this the future is conceptualized as being post-race and a society that has experienced ethnic mixing. So to some degree, the cast reflects that. We see some actors of color, some who appear somewhat racially ambiguous. But we hear from Gary Ross, the director of the film, that being African American still matters, like in the contemporary US. So Ross pointed out that Thresh and Rue, these are the two tributes from District 11, will be African American. So we're hearing this sort of competing information here that this is both a post-race imagined future, and yet being African American still matters. So in the world of the film, race is not explicitly discussed, consistent with what sociologists would call a colorblind ideology. But the Hunger Games shows us that race still shapes society as well as the games, as it is always African Americans from District 11 that are chosen to be tributes. So thinking about gender inequality in the context of the games, we see that gender shapes the organization not only of society but of the games themselves. So the image you see here with the paired male-female tributes is a common visual in the film. So first of all, we know the rules of the game are such that every district must supply a male and a female tribute, and we visually see these male-female pairs consistently throughout the film. And interestingly, even though the tributes are a range of ages, we almost always see that the male tribute is taller than his female counterpart from the same district. So here we see that the gender binary still remains an organizing system of society in this imagined future. In some ways, the differences between male and female tributes are minimized. For example, both the male and female tributes fight and kill other children in the context of the games. But in other ways, we do see some emphasis on gender difference. The male tributes are more likely to exhibit brute strength. The female tributes are more likely to engage in more strategic ways of killing in the games. Gender also plays out in what we see of the larger society. There's some indication that this future world is conceptualized as post-gender, but we see that gender still matters through the visuals of the film. Overall, we see normative gender presentations, that is to say, female characters dressing in feminine clothes, albeit in this very stylized manner of the Capitol, men tending to dress in more masculine clothes. And we certainly see a gendered division of labor, particularly in scenes from District 12. We see women in the domestic sphere, we see the men working in the mines, and in the Capitol we see it is almost exclusively white men who are in positions of power. One interesting piece of this has to do with the way in which men in the Capitol are portrayed. So we see some exceptions to gender normativity among these characters. We see that these characters are playing with masculinity and gender performance in a way that's interesting. However, our reading of this is not that this is meant to suggest something about gender or even about sexuality, but rather this femininity is performed by these male characters represents the superficial nature of the capital. So here this is potentially problematic as we see that this femininity of men is used to signify that superficiality, where the superficial is associated with the feminine. And further evidence of this is that we see that the most powerful men are the least likely to take on this feminine gender presentation. So returning to our heroine, Katniss, Katniss is an interesting character in that she does pose some challenges to heteronormativity. In some of the early scenes in District 12, we see her in the domestic sphere. Here she's comforting her sister. And then she moves into this role of the hunter. And what's interesting about this, in some of these scenes, we see her going outside of District 12 in order to hunt for food for her family. And this is portrayed as a transgression, right? She's breaking the rules, but it's a transgression of class, not a transgression of gender. That is to say, it's against the rules because the Capitol has said that these areas are off limits, but it's not portrayed as something that a girl or a woman shouldn't be doing. Later in the film, we see her wearing these high femme costumes, and although she's a little bit resistant to these kinds of clothing, we don't see her really resist. And in fact, we see her take pleasure in, for example, being the dress that goes along with her being the girl on fire. In the Hunger Games, we see a classic love triangle between Katniss and her two potential male love interests. So this is portrayed initially as resistance on Katniss's part, that she's not interested in engaging in a relationship with either of these men, largely because she's living in poverty and then later fighting to the death in the context of the games. But although she initially resists, she eventually is drawn into this love triangle. So we see some of this resistance between conversations between Katniss and Gale, where Katniss is resisting here both heterosexual romance as well as this heteronormative family life. However, we do see her later move into this strategic relationship with Peeta. So in the context of the games, Katniss and Peeta strategically manufacture a love story in order as a strategy to help them be successful in the games. And while this love story is not real, at least not on Katniss's part, at least not initially, this narrative that heterosexual romance can literally save your life plays out here in the context of the games. So in this quote, Katniss is talking to her trainer and mentor, Haymitch, and Haymitch is encouraging her to use this love story as a strategy in the games. So ultimately, although she was initially resistant, Katniss comes around, and in the end, the last book and movie, she does choose between one of these two and gets married and has children. So to sum up, the story we're told is about class and class inequality, but what we are shown is that race and gender also matter. They also organize society. So this narrative in the Hunger Games really fails to recognize the intersections between these systems of oppression. Although I did point out that the Hunger Games provide some perhaps limited challenges to normative gender performances. So what's interesting to me is that given this radical message about class inequality, resistance, and revolution, there's a missed opportunity to critically examine race and gender and how these systems of oppression relate to class, both in this dystopian future world of Panem as well as the contemporary US. So circling back around to a point I made earlier, what's interesting in looking at these dystopian futures is to see what's imaginable, right? What can we imagine? We can imagine a reality show in which children fight to the death, but we can't imagine a world without a gender binary. And I think that in looking at these texts that are written in the contemporary moment about future times really tell us something interesting about how we think about gender in our world today.